Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It is so good to have you with us today, leaders. And I'm so excited to have David Kinnaman back on Church Pulse Weekly. David, great to
Hey,
see
Carey.
you.
Hey, Carey. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to hang out. So we are talking about mental health. And I got to tell you, just totally transparently, if you would ask me last Friday, how you feeling, Carey? I would have said, I'm doing pretty good. David, thank you so much. How are you? And this weekend, it just kind of came out of nowhere and everything just piled up on me.
Man, I know it's interesting how our lives work, where you can have so many good things happen in a row, and then it feels like out of the blue things can crop up, or in the case that our family's been going through, it's like this chronic thing of dealing with issues and challenges for my wife's health, and then of course the coronavirus. And I feel like mental and emotional health has become, rightly so, such an important topic for us to talk about, kind of as we've all come out of the sort of the pandemic wall, that sort of how we're all sort of exhausted. So yeah, I think the ebbs and flows of life are so interesting, and it's so important for us to sort of understand a little bit more about what we can do in terms of mental and emotional health.
Well, we're talking with Pete Scazzero today, and I'm excited for that. But the challenge, of course, is I was going back in my mind to what Rick Warren said a little while ago on Church Pulse Weekly, that there's this tsunami of grief. And I'm like, well, that must be what it was. And, you move through it, but I found that with my own mental health and some of the challenges of leadership, that you think you're great, then it sneaks up on you, and then you have to get through it, and then you're okay again, hopefully. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
So we've got some data points we want to share with leaders today before we jump into our conversation with Pete. Tell us what you got.
Well, one of the things we've been doing as with our partner Glue, we've been launching this brand new big cities initiative. And as part of that, we're doing both national research and then city specific research. We're starting in Kansas City, Columbus, Dallas, Fort Worth, and South Florida. Those are the four cities we're beginning with. But as part of this national research, we just a month ago now, the data is just a few weeks actually old. And we found that 44% of Americans say that counseling service is something that their community needs, that churches or Christian organizations could provide. And this is one of the top three things that people say they want churches to provide. So counseling services is way up there. Homeless services, companionship for the elderly were two other things that Americans are interested in. And so I think it's really interesting. We're at this moment where we've got this, as you say, from Rick Warren, a tsunami of grief, a tsunami of mental health challenges. There were already a lot of issues, and it's like already there was a lot of awareness of this, especially among younger Christians and younger people, millennials. And so I think there's this real open door for us when it comes to church leaders. As church leaders, we can make mental and emotional health part of our discipleship efforts. It's not sort of a sideline issue. It's like if you're one of the crazies, you can go see the counselor, or, that's like for you nutso people.
Yeah.
It's like everyone is dealing with mental and emotional health issues. And people are telling us this is one of the ways that they believe that churches and Christian organizations can actually provide good in their communities.
Couldn't agree more with that. Just for the record, I currently have a therapist, a Christian counselor I go see. I highly recommend it. It's been a big part of our story. And honestly, I think why I'm still in leadership today, David. But the joke when I was the lead pastor of Connexus Church is we didn't have in-house counseling, but we had like trusted partners. So just, hey, you're looking for a counselor. Here's a list of 5, some great women and men in our community who do an awesome job. And my joke was that I think we keep 5 of them employed full time with all the referrals we were doing. So if you're looking for a model, not every church has the resources or the calling to do that in-house. But if you kind of pre-vet really great counselors that you have confidence in, and then we always had a little benevolent fund just in case people didn't have money for it, where we could subsidize or help or get them started or something. So, okay, that's fascinating. And I'm glad to see that's on the agenda of a lot of churches and church members.
Yeah, absolutely. And even this data that I'm going to share next is really about sort of the whole community. So, this is 44% of all Americans say they want counseling services, the data I just told you. And then 74% of Christians who don't actively attend a church, we call these non-practicing Christians.
Right.
And there are more of those now than there were prior to the pandemic, because a lot of people sort of dropped off practicing their faith through local church attendance, because they just sort of were going to sit the digital church sort of revolution out. But 74%, 3 out of 4 non-practicing Christians, they're sort of lapsed attenders, say they would be interested in churches in their local community if those churches offered preaching and programs on mental health and emotional well-being. 62% of all adults say that's true. And even 1 in 3 people who say they are no faith at all, they're atheist, agnostic, sort of religiously unaffiliated, say they would be interested in churches if they offered preaching and programs on mental health and emotional well-being. So part of the picture we're trying to paint for you is that the door is much larger. The opening in our society for Christian content on mental and emotional health is wider than ever. And I think the caveat to that is that we don't just pretend we know what we're doing, because there's a real expertise that I think we as pastors have to, where we are trained, we should lean in, but where we're not trained, we should make sure we're leaning in on professionals. But incredible opportunities, I believe, that we're seeing in the data coming out of coronavirus.
Well, it's a real opportunity as well. I mean, and I think the thing that goes through my mind as you share that, David, is yeah, if you don't offer it, the world does. I've been a podcaster for years, but I've been a podcast listener for over a decade. And that is what is happening in the broader marketplace is people are just getting discipled around mindfulness or other
Right.
techniques. And I think the Christian voice, and this is why I think what Pete is doing is resonating so deeply, is he's saying, no, that emotional mental health journey, that is a discipleship journey. And so I think for Christians, one of my pet theories is that one of the reasons counseling is so prevalent these days is because we kind of dropped the ball on discipleship. Like good
Right.
discipleship should not replace totally counseling and that kind of thing and working through the particular dynamics of your story, your situation. But I think it would be less necessary if we did a better job counseling people in these areas that scripture actually speaks to.
Yeah, you've maybe heard this phrase, we're sometimes so heavenly minded, we're no earthly good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think there's this sense of the moment that we're in, and it's not just because of the moment, but coming out of the pandemic and all the things that the church has to attest to, the witness to the good that faith brings, is that we have a chance to really talk about all the areas of human flourishing: financial, vocational, mental and emotional health, relational, spiritual, of course. But if we don't do that, I actually think we really lose the chance to disciple and evangelize, especially emerging generations. We see this in the data so often that essentially younger Christians don't just want to know that Christianity is true; they also want to know that it's good, and
Hmm.
it's got to be good for their friends, for their peers, for their communities, for their own mental and emotional well-being. And I think we have an incredible opportunity, because Scripture calls us to that kind of sort of fully embodied heart, mind, body, and soul, sort of fully embodied way of living this way in Jesus.
Okay. You got one more data point you were saying, David?
I do. Yeah. I think the last thing is just really kind of doubling down on what we've been talking about, where as we look at 2 different statements in this new cities research, one of them was, there are Christian organizations in my local area that actively support my well-being. And then the second was, local churches in my area care about my overall well-being.
Hmm.
And about half of practicing Christians agreed with that statement.
Ooh.
And that's, I think, something really interesting. Like even practicing Christians, there's half of practicing Christians who don't see the sort of churches, the local churches in their community showing up to care about their overall well-being. And then among people who have no faith, it's only 6%. So
Whoa.
again, only 6% of people with no faith say there are Christian organizations in my local area that actively support my well-being. Only 6% of those with no faith say local churches in my area care about my overall well-being, kind of 2 sides of a coin. And this really interesting picture, I think, emerges of, we do have a lot of these resources, or maybe we haven't been as front and center, or we need to develop them more fully. But even among practicing Christians, and then especially among non-believers in our communities, that is not at all apparent that we're doing those kinds of things, and a huge opportunity for the church to step into that void.
Well, and it's so interesting, because you can end up in this school where you think, or school of thought, where you think, well, that's not really our province in the church. But in my own personal Bible reading the other day, just the devotional plan I was using, it was either Tim Keller, I use a couple, Tim Keller or Nikki Gumbel. So relatively good authority. And I did win the prize in Greek back in seminary, but that was a long time ago, David. That was a long time ago.
We're going to
And I
send you
didn't pull out.
send you a trophy for it.
Yeah, that's right. It's worth a lot of money these days. No, it's not. But I didn't pull out my Greek dictionary, but it was a reminder that Zoe is one of the words that's often used in the Gospels to describe life. And it was kind of it's Jesus' thing about the kingdom of heaven is near and the kingdom of heaven is coming, but then it's at your hand. And the whole idea that salvation in part is realized and experienced in this life and fully when Christ returns. And so there's that idea that you don't have to wait entirely to be healed until the second coming, until eternity. And I think it's easy to forget, particularly in evangelical circles, that no, some of this is realizable now, not fully. Not everybody gets healed, as you know, not everybody gets well, as we know. And yet there is a dimension of life that can come to you now. And it's interesting that that is what the world wants. And a singular, like 6% of people think that's what the church offers. What a massive opportunity.
It's a huge opportunity. And it's just a reminder for us as leaders, as I'm thinking about what we've all gone through in the last year plus, that I think one of the great revealers about this whole season has been that we as leaders also have the same mental and emotional health needs that anyone else does.
Oh yeah.
And so it's a reminder to us that we're not just coaches, we're not just like general managers of the Christian team. We're like on the court with others dealing with the same kinds of issues. And if we're going to be the kind of holistic disciplers that Jesus calls us to, we have to take good care of our own mental and emotional health and have the right language and the right lanes and the right opportunities and the right, humility about all of that. And it's a beautiful picture of the church being the church when you have people who are counselors and therapists and psychiatrists and, all the things that we need to help support mental and emotional health. And the church is the place for that, but it doesn't have to just be us as professionals. We just have to be very self-aware about where we can show up and how we can support I think this great opportunity for the church today.
Well, just as we jump into our conversation with Pete Scazzero, you're reminding me that it was 15 years ago that I had my season of intense and deep burnout. And at the time, I was like, I thought it was over. I thought, oh, well, this is a good run. I guess it finished early. I'm done. I had no idea, number one, that I would recover, but number two, that would probably become the greatest identification point for leaders. Like I think about, God willing, the next 20 years, I'm going to talk about living in a way today that will help you thrive tomorrow, probably for the rest of my life. And there is this sense in that makes you a lot more human when people go, oh, you struggle too. And if you can get to the other side, and when I was burning out, I couldn't help anybody. I could barely help myself. But if you get a degree of healing in your life, that can be something that God really uses, like Rick Warren did, back to that interview when he talked about Matthew's death and the ministry, or Tim Keller when he was talking about his cancer and how it just changed how he saw things. And people see you as more human. And you're also often able, when you start to be healed and can process it, to help people with that. So it's a fascinating framework, David.
And I think it's an important part for me. What I'm hearing when you talk about that is also something that I've really emphasized in my relationship and parenting with my kids. Emily, Annika, Zach, 22, almost 22, 20, and 16. And as many of you listeners will know, my wife died, their mom died last year. And in addition to that, they're human beings. They've had their ups and downs and their struggles. And one of the ways that I've found that has been helpful is not only being honest about my own stuff, which is considerable and something we work through in therapy and, accountability and all the things. But so being self-aware, being honest about that, but also then as they've gone through their own struggles, we often talked about like how going through whatever it is we go through prepares us to be on mission with Jesus for others who are suffering. And, that suffering, God doesn't waste our suffering. God doesn't waste our mental and emotional health struggles, especially if we take them to him. Again, I don't think there's like magic wands for these problems usually. And that's part of the problem. It's certainly prayer, certainly going to scripture, certainly there's ways we find deep spiritual resources in our Christian tradition. But I think it's been a way that, as we try to disciple millennials, especially in Gen Z, that we've made Christianity so simplistic and straightforward, and like, it's going to mean that you're going to have, there's no problems, and but instead to say, like, in conversations I've had with my kids, like about pornography, which is an incredible challenge to mental and emotional health among younger generations. I always talk about the fact that, there's how do we find grace? How do we talk openly and transparently? How do we put accountability in place? And then importantly, like, I say to my kids, like, your whole generation is in flames around issues of pornography because of access through screens. So if God's going to help you go through the challenges that any of us as human beings go through in terms of wrestling with our sexuality, then maybe it's not just to help get you better, but also then to help find a way that you could be on mission with Jesus to talk openly and transparently with grace and conviction and truth into your peer set. Because I promise every single one of them is dealing with sexuality and exposure to some kind of level of pornography than any previous generation. It's just the power of screens today is unbelievable. So using these places of our brokenness, of human brokenness, to talk about where do we then find our strength in the Lord, our strength in others, and also that these places of suffering aren't just for us to like somehow get better, but then to be used, as you're saying, your mental and emotional health issues from 15 years ago have actually built a more solid foundation, with which you can actually minister more authentically to leaders who are struggling with many of the same issues.
Well, David, that's been a fascinating prequel to the conversation with Pete Scazzero. So I recently had a fantastic conversation in my books with Pete. There's rarely any other kind, but we kind of explored some new territory. So with that said, thanks, David. And Pete is the founding pastor of New Life Church in Queens, New York. He's the author of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and his brand new book is called Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. Here's my conversation with Pete Scazzero. Pete, it's good to be back together again. Thanks for coming back on with us at ChurchPulse Weekly.
Carey, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the invite.
It's a joy. You got a brand new book and an endless amount of opportunity to speak into a growing crisis, which appears to be the mental health crisis, not just in the church, but also amongst its leaders. What is the relationship, let's start here, between mental health and emotional health, Pete? Because and let's add spiritual health there, because I wonder if they're all mixed together. We say I'm spiritually healthy, but emotionally I'm a disaster. Like, how are they all connected?
Boy, it's a good question. Mental health and emotional health. I mean, I think we're all on a spectrum, aren't we? Right?
Yeah.
In fact, there's a great book that was written many years ago with DSM-4. Now it's DSM-5, but the whole spectrum. We've all got our challenges, and so. My focus is emotional health. I consider, we cross a line where now we're getting to professionals who need to be, intervening. I'm a pastor, like yourself, Carey. So I come at it as a pastor, leader, equipper, and I'm doing integration of emotional health and spirituality. And basically my story is that the way I was trained and developed as a leader and as a pastor did not deal with the emotional component of who we are. And so I had a crash and ended up in a therapist's office. And I remember learning how to feel, and like listen, feeling and loss and grief and I didn't have any vocabulary for these things. And it just, God met me. God met Jerry and I, my wife, and it opened up a whole new world for me theologically. And so I ended up going back to my professors and say, how did I get into this, like, kind of a compartmentalized spirituality? He goes, that goes back to Augustine, it goes, and I went back to my professor. I had a professor at Princeton Seminary where I took a course in Augustine, and he was a world scholar. And I remember him saying in class, you're all Neoplatonists. I was like, why? And I went back to him. I said, how are you Neoplatonists?
What is that? Like dualism, or what is that?
Yeah, kind of like the body is bad and the spirit is good. Kind of like
okay.
Kind of like, so like that's why you're hung up on sexuality, because you can't talk about it, because you got this kind of over-realized eschatology, everything's spiritual. And one of my Old Testament professors said, it's how we understand what it means to be made in God's image as a whole person, in the Hebrew sense of we're whole people, which has different aspects, not parts, but aspects like relational and social and spiritual and intellectual and emotional. And you talk about being made in God's image, discipleship's got to address all of that. So my work in the early years in the 90s was like, what does it mean to disciple someone and do development in the emotional component? And that was my early work, digging into that. So it's been a great journey, but I'm not a professional therapist. I'm a pastor. So that's my angle, coming at it from the perspective of leadership development, discipleship, and unpacking that. And then this, the high level stuff that's beyond, I refer out to people who are specialists and gifted in that area.
How do you assess whether you are emotionally healthy or not? And I know you've written books on this and they're diagnostics, but like, just for the guy who's listening or woman who's listening, they don't have a pen nearby. It's like, let me do a little gut check. Like, how do I know how I'm doing?
It's a great question. How do you break it down? Because I remember I used to hear about it even as a young Christian before I got into all this, but no one ever quite dug into it. Like, how do you actually get at it? So it's elements such as this. It's like your awareness of, first of all, self-awareness. Okay, you're aware of what's going on inside of you, your interior life. Life is not just everything out there. I'm building my family, my work, my money, my career, the church. We're very good at the outer life. We go to school for that, but we're not so good at working on the inner landscape, what's going on inside of our interior life. So it begins with, and I was your classic type A guy, just making it happen. What am I feeling? What's going on inside of it? What's happening inside of my body? So just that self-awareness is like the first place it starts, but that requires a slowing down. And then it's things like knowing how my family of origin impacts who I am today. Big area. Going back 3-4 generations, we didn't just come out of nowhere, but that I'm aware of how my family, my culture has impacted me today. So everything in how my family did conflict, how it measures success, how my family does relationships and sexuality, the list goes on. Money, bonding, connecting. That's a big element of it. Grief and loss is another big element. 2/3 of the Psalms are laments. You have a whole book called Lamentations. And I wrote a paper on one of David's laments in seminary, but we never made the connection that's part of the Christian life, is part of growing into maturity is
was sad back then. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Guess back then it wasn't so good.
Even Carey, even just loving well, loving well was not considered like a real important thing, like how I do relationships. And so when I think about emotional health, it's getting into all of these areas that we just tend not to talk about very much in the church. We preach sermons about it, but we don't actually break it down and bring people somewhere with it. So
how did you first realize you were emotionally unhealthy?
My wife quit my church. She'd been complaining. Honestly, of course there were symptoms, right?
So walk us through some of those early symptoms before Jerry quit.
I think one was my life was spinning out of control. I had the sense of always having too much to do in too little time, feeling overloaded, hurried, rushed, and having a pit in my stomach often, or feeling a knot in my neck. But I was just the word for me was like, it was like this elevator. I couldn't get off it. The thing was just moving so fast. Again, at this point I'm pastoring. That was one really big indication was I was doing way more than my inner life could sustain. I wasn't paying attention to me. I think another indication was I wasn't experiencing a lot of delight and joy in serving Jesus. I was just doing a lot for Jesus, building our church. We're church planting other churches. I was a quote successful pastor, but I was on the inside, I was miserable, but I was doing it for God. And then I think another symptom was just, I think in our marriage was stuck. We loved each other, but we didn't know how to love each other.
Before Jerry drew the line in the sand, How did you justify that to yourself? You must have justified it to yourself. This is a little bit of projection on my part because it's a very familiar story. Me in my 30s, I'm like, no, that's just normal life, man. I'm successful. Leave me alone. Like, what was your self-talk that made you think you didn't have a problem?
Well, there was fruit. There was fruit. People were coming to Christ. Maybe they weren't changing deeply, but they were coming to Christ. It was shallow, but what did I know? And like, honestly, everybody else was doing it. Like everybody else seemed even more out of control. And so I thought I'm doing okay. And all my models around me, the standards of success, the way success was measured, I was meeting those metrics. So as long as things weren't falling apart, like it's kind of holding it together and we're moving forward, I'm like, and everyone's praising me and telling me I'm doing great. So yeah, I just justified it. And I guess theologically, I was fine. Like, in other words, there wasn't a paradigm of a biblical framework of saying you're missing the core of Christianity here. You're not living what you're preaching. But no one ever said that to me. And I sure couldn't see it in myself. I was too busy.
Well, and did you think, like now looking back, you can say you're not living what you're preaching, but at the time, did you think you were living what you were preaching?
You know, Carey, here's a funny thing about it. I was talking to someone about the other day. I was having days alone with God. Yeah, I mean, I was having a lot of time with God.
I had a better prayer life before I burned out than since I burned out. And I'm like, just give me that part of my unhealth back, please.
But, you know, it was out of anxiety. Again, we're back. It wasn't so much I'd go for a day alone with God, but it wasn't so much for communion with him.
Right.
I needed from him. I needed to get from God to get the work done. And so it was almost like a more of a strategic day out of prayer than it was actually a day of being with God. The whole emphasis was it was getting the work done. So it was God became a means to an end. And I became very attached to certain things, right? It wasn't, letting go was not like on the agenda. It was grow this thing. It was very, I look back, I'm like, oh my God, so what happens is I think there was just a lot of false self in there and I couldn't distinguish it. And I was going too hard and fast to even pay attention to it.
Yeah, I hear you. So let me give you a little context because many of our leaders listening, our subscribers have heard it already, but you can't because of the way we're sequencing these episodes. But we had a conversation with Julie Wilson and Kayla Steckline, both of whom lost their husbands to suicide, both of whom were arguably at the pinnacle of their career, so to speak, today. Both were very young, 20s or 30s, right? So super young husbands, very successful, large growing churches, theoretically happy family. And both Andrew and Jared took their own lives. So died by suicide. In their analysis of the time leading up to Jared and Andrew's death, both of them said that there were pressures on the church from the church and the pressures that the pastors put on themselves, that Jared and Andrew put on themselves, that were obviously unhealthy. And so I asked them this question. I want to ask you this question. What is it about the church that is systemically unhealthy, that produces people like you and me who have to go through some kind of cathartic moment to kind of come up with a new way of operating? Is there something wrong with the system that is producing that, in your view?
Carey, I think people are people. I mean, if you look at the life of Jesus, he was under a lot of pressure, right? Yeah. I mean, the crowds pressured him to be something he wasn't, right? They wanted him to be a king. His family pressured him. They didn't like what he was going. The Pharisees and Sadducees, they sure pressured him. He wasn't the religious leader they thought. I mean, his own family was, in hometown of Nazareth, rejected him. I mean, he in a sense, he was under enormous pressure. So I think it's funny, I don't look at the church system as much as how we develop leaders. I go back to how I was formed and shaped as a pastor leader, having large gaps to it. I call it Americanized Jesus. Because I think we walk into the church system and God's intention is that we actually shape it out of our deep spirituality. So in other words, we've got enough differentiation, enough maturity, enough depth of inner life that we're actually walking into this system. Of course, it's going to be twisted, it's going to be worldly, but we have done enough inner formation ourselves that we walk into the system and we actually bring it to a new place. The problem is, if I go in looking for the church to give it to me, that's a problem. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think people are going to be people. The world system has been so powerful since the days of Jesus. It hasn't changed, because behind that are, I think, powerful cultural and demonic forces. To me, the issue is how we're doing our formation of people. I call it discipleship, because all I see as leadership development is really high-level discipleship.
Okay.
That's why I ended up focusing on discipleship to get to leadership, because I realized think of it. You're going to think of Jesus and 12 disciples. He's discipling them to be leaders, but it's high level intensity discipleship. And I think that's what leadership is. If I was going to do a seminary, I'd make people go to a therapist. I would have them have a spiritual director. I'd have them live a rule of life as a kind of a monastic rule of life. I would put a lot less emphasis on the intellectual development, although I love Greek and Hebrew and history and systematic theology and all that, and much more on your prayer life, your formation, your inner life, your family of origin impact on who you are today, how you do relationships, sexuality. All that is core to formation if you're going to be a leader. But we don't touch so many of those things very much in our development of leaders. So we have recurring scandals and crises because the pressure of leadership is enormous.
It's enormous. What is the Americanized Jesus, and how is he different from the crucified Jesus?
Well, it's interesting. I've got this chapter, follow the crucified, not the Americanized Jesus. And it's not so much an analysis of American culture, believe it or not. Everything, it teaches us analyzing American culture and how it's actually, I actually got it from the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Matthew. I spent about 3 to 4 years studying Matthew, if you could imagine, like in my morning time with God. And at one point, I go through over and over again. I would just do a manuscript study, just kind of going through it, meditating, Lectio Divina, and all that stuff. At one point, I just said, let me just write down what were the pressures of Jesus discipling the 12. And I ended up with 4 things that were the core issues that he had to hit again and again and again, because they'd been formed by the religious culture of their day, the Judaism of their day. And it was so in their bones. We like to say Jesus in your heart, but grandpa's in your bones. It was so in their bones. And I call it the Americanized Jesus, but actually it's the temptations of the wilderness. It's what the disciples were dealing with in the first century. And I got 4 things. You want to hear real quick?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. The first is be popular. That's the Americanized Jesus, be popular. And we see that, when Peter was into Jesus, but he wasn't into the crucified Jesus, So when he heard about the cross, he's like, never, Lord, like he's going to lose. He's number 1 on the team. Like he's not going to be popular if this goes down. So he's like totally against it. And the same with us, right? Jump down from this temple. Everyone will believe in you. One of the temptations. So the Americanized Jesus is be popular, but be impress people. And yet the crucified Jesus is, reject popularity completely. Just reject it. And you have nothing to do, and Jesus had nothing to do with being popular. The second is to be great. Be great. Show that you're great, and Jesus says, no, reject greatness. And Bruner's got a commentary on Matthew, and he calls it greatnessism. And he goes, reject greatnessism. And Jesus rejected it categorically. And in fact, there was nothing great about Jesus by the world standards. His ministry wasn't great. The 12 weren't great. His beginnings weren't great. I mean, everything about him was not great. In fact, he was most impressed with unimpressive people, if anything. And so we reject greatnessism. And again, we want to be great with him alone, whatever that means. And then thirdly is the world's discipleship is, disciples wanted to be great. They wanted to be a success by the world standards, right? And the idea of a crucifixion was like horrific. And Peter was going to be a failure, and there was no way he was going that direction. So again, you got Peter. Again, I have to say Peter. He wants to be great. He wants to be successful. He wants to be popular. And then the last thing is I call it Americanized Jesus, is to avoid suffering and failure.
Which is every prayer meeting you've ever been to. Right?
Exactly. That's why I go.
Yeah.
That's why I spent my days alone with God, so I wouldn't fail. The whole point, the whole following of Jesus was to keep myself from failing and and suffering. I don't want to suffer, and yet with the following to crucified Jesus, no, you actually embrace suffering and failure. So it's the exact opposite of everything. So it's actually the Americanized Jesus is just like we personify as a culture everything that Jesus is trying to get out of us. Greatness. Even again, how we measure success is so screwed up, and I measured it all wrong. I ended up saying, what is success for Jesus? What is it? And I realized, what success is? Becoming who God wants me to become and doing what God calls me to do. Period. In his way, in his timetable. So I could be declining in number and succeeding tremendous. I could be growing in number and actually failing. And that's John the Baptist to me. His numbers went down. He was succeeding wonderfully. And I think we've got it all. I think we're so Americanized in our thinking, and post-Enlightenment, this American culture. I mean, you're Canadian, North America.
No, it's similar. So
it's West. No, and actually, we've exported it to Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Mideast. We export this, but it's really because it's underneath it. It's New Testament. It's the very struggle Jesus had to get out of the 12 disciples. Greatness, success, popularity. He had to drive it out of them, and it just took time.
You're right. There's a correlation, Pete, between success and faithfulness that I think is present in the West or in the Americanized Jesus. And yet, I don't want to give you a statement. Let me give you a question. Failing isn't necessarily a sign of faithfulness. It can be a sign that you're doing something wrong. So how do you discern that? Like, how do you know? Like, and growth is not necessarily, and I see this a lot online. People say, oh, if it's growing, there has to be something rotten at the core. Exactly. Is that always true? Like, where do you find how do you measure? What are the criteria?
Well, I think it's I think, again, if I was a leader, some mega churches are definitely God's will. God gives some men and women to establish large ministries globally and organize. It's a gift from God.
And some failing churches are just failing churches, right?
Exactly.
It's not faithfulness.
So again, we're not measuring it by these external criteria necessarily, but I think we're looking for some quality markers internally, right? I think we're looking for some people are bearing fruit and abounding. You may just be with, I was with one pastor from Damascus, in Syria. What does it look like to succeed in the middle of a civil war? But I think there's some, I'm abiding in Jesus, right? John 15, I'm bearing fruit, but what does it look like to be bearing fruit, right? I think some quality of life coming out of us to other people around us. And if we're not relaxing in Jesus, in fact, I ended up with this huge gospel study I did over a few years, which I ended up going from Matthew after 3-4 years, then going to John. Then going to Mark. So I was just so captivated by this. I said, what does it mean to follow Jesus and make a disciple? But I think there's an invitation to relax in Jesus and to detach from the world. And so we attach to him and listen. We listen to him. Matthew 17, listen to me. Peter wants to, he's got plans to put 3 boots up when he gets his revelation. And the Father's speech is listen. Listen to him. And I think that's the core of, I wish I had been more focused on that. Am I relaxing in Jesus? Am I trusting in Jesus? And that's the translation of one scholar of what does it mean to be trusting in Jesus? It's the modern translation might be, it means to be relaxing in Jesus.
Wow.
That's what I measure myself. Am I relaxing in Jesus today? Letting myself be held in his love. Like that's a success. And to me, if I can be, quote, growing something, but I'm anxious, I'm failing. So I've got some internal markers that I'm watching on a daily basis. Is my being with Jesus and myself sufficient to sustain what I'm actually doing today? I'm doing this podcast with you.
Yeah.
I've got some things to do after it. but it's a constant monitoring moment by moment of my interior life with Jesus, my communion with him, and my communion with myself, and the pace at which I'm living. That just forces me to slow down.
Yeah, yeah. So this is a bit of a weird question, and feel free to say next, okay? Because it is a weird question, Pete. But here we are 14, 15 months into this global crisis. If you were spiritually grounded, healthy, emotionally healthy prior to the crisis, what might you be feeling now? And if you were unhealthy prior to the crisis, what might you be feeling now? Do you see where the question is going? Yeah. So
I think it'd be in both cases, you're depressed. I mean, it's depressing. It is painful. It's depressing. I heard the New York Times use the word languishing.
Yeah. Adam Grant, languishing. Yeah, totally.
It's really a hard time. I mean, there's a sense of life being suspended on so many levels. I mean, on all age groups, right? If you have children, teenagers, young adults, I mean, it's just a tough time. We're in the middle of a global crisis that's not going away. So it's depressing. But I think if we're at the same time for many of us, we came into the COVID and we did not have the equipping we needed to at least manage and go forward. So, but I don't beat up anybody for that, but I think it's an invitation from God to the church in general that, okay, the kind of discipleship we've been doing in America, in the Western church in particular, really needs to be shifted from this consumer entertainment, just having lots of people in a room, just consuming sermons and podcasts, to actually like, I've got to get equipped to follow Jesus here. I've got to get serious. And I think that's the wake-up call for the church.
I asked Dr. Anita Phillips this, and again, you didn't have the benefit of pre-listening, but the question is, on my platform, I've just heard from so many leaders who are like, it's no big deal. I want to get back. I want to get everyone back in the room. Wow. Not really an issue. I don't live in New York. I don't live in California. It's like almost like a denial thing is what I keep picking up on my channels over the last year. She said that's kind of a white evangelical thing, which I thought was a really interesting perspective. What would you say, like, what is going on if there are leaders who are listening? I don't know why you guys are still talking about all this trauma, this crisis, like my life's back to normal. Is there anything is that masquerading something underneath that?
I'd say it's more of a poor theology. I mean, listen, if you don't do feelings, let's say grief, here we are in the middle of grief and loss. Okay, maybe you're living in a part of the country where you've not had gigantic losses. All right.
Right.
So I know I was with the woman the other day. She goes to a church, a Latino woman. They lost 100 people died in their church. So right now, India's full crisis.
Yeah.
So the fact that maybe you're not, but we care about India. I care about, God loves the world. And so it's so critical as pastors and leaders, we lead our church to be able to grieve their losses. In other words, this issue of enlarging your soul through grief and loss, this is a critical moment of formation of our churches. So to get back to normal and just move ahead, I think of David after in 2 Samuel when Jonathan and Saul were killed in battle. He stops the armies and he writes a lament and he commands the troops to lament. And so we need to lead our people to grieve, into a healthy grieving. It's not over yet, but this is not a season. The Bible speaks of seasons. We're in a global season here that's so intense that the world needs us, the church needs us to lead people into appropriate grief. And I think there's some rituals to do. I think singing laments is not such a bad thing. Talking about it, giving people space. They say 1 of 9 people in North America have someone who died, know someone at least who's died. You know, they've experienced loss on some level. But I even talk to parents whose teenagers have not been in school. You know, there's been so many losses that people that need to be validated and heard, because we can't grow into maturity without absorbing and integrating our losses, and thus allowing God to do new and deep work in us to grow us up into people like Jesus. I mean, he was called man of sorrows.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You share about discovering treasures buried in grief and loss. What are those treasures? How do we get to them?
Well, think of it this way. There's lots of treasures, but a few are things like Jeremiah in Lamentations, when he's just watched cannibalism and Jerusalem razed to the ground. And then he has this revelation of God. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never end. Great is your faithfulness. That came out of a deep well of pain. And there's this revelation of God that can come no other way but through loss. That's one. I think we also, our masks come off in loss. You don't care what people think is so unimportant. And because it just doesn't matter. I mean, you're at a funeral, who cares how much money you make or what your title is? I mean, it just, grief and loss just levels everybody. It just brings us all in the same way. It's very human. And so all those masks come off. And, it was Henry Nouwen who wrote years ago, the degree to which we grieve our losses is the degree to which we are compassionate people. In other words, the quality of our compassion is directly related to the level in which we're able to engage our own grief and loss. Yeah. And people don't look at Christians as compassionate. They see us as judgmental.
Yep.
And that's directly related to how we handle loss and grief, which is we medicate, we deny it, we go around it. That's why we love addictions, right? Whether it's alcohol or pornography or food or work. Me, I medicated my pain with work.
Yeah.
I don't have to feel it. I'll just get busy.
You get rewarded, right? Get a promotion and a raise.
But this, nobody wants to lean into grief.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard.
How do you lean into your grief?
Well, I'll tell you, what one of the ways I do, and I'll say the pandemic for a minute. What's been important for me with the pandemic has been to read obituaries.
Oh, wow.
Of people who've died, read their stories, just to be present with them. And for a long time, I would take every night at dinner and I say, we're going to have a moment of silence and remember those who've died. Now, again, we're in New York, but it's not just New York. It's the world. Gosh. And every person who dies is a human being with a story, with the mom and dad and brothers and sisters and kids and neighbors. And oh my gosh. So that's one for me. And journaling is really important. I think of David, if 2/3 of his Psalms are laments. Yeah. He's writing, poetry, he's writing songs, but it's his 2/3 of that 150 are griefs and laments, but he's doing it before the Lord. So for me, I've got this little exercise, explore the iceberg of just, what am I sad about? And now I have my 26-year-old daughter is living with us right now, and came home because obviously COVID and all that, and was lonely living in an apartment by yourself as a single person, and everything's remote, week after week, month after month. We're 13 months into this thing now, going into our 14th month. And boy, oh boy, I mean, to be present with her disorientation and loneliness of missing friends and work, and that's just one person here, let alone I have 4 daughters, but every one of our kids are impacted. They're young adults, and a couple are married, but and just the people we know who've died, and I think the news. I mean, I do care about the world. I think what makes us different is we care about the world getting vaccinated, not just ourselves.
Right.
And because God really does love the world. He loves the world.
What happens if you don't grieve your losses?
You repress it. And so what happens is we've got a lot of repressed people, like Jack in the Boxes. I was talking to someone, a pastor in her 60s who just had an affair, and so why would a person, after 40 years of pastoring, just launch into a reckless affair and blow everything up? And part of it is just repression, stuffing it down. And so often people act out because they just haven't been given context to be human, like to be angry, to be sad, to be afraid, to be confused, to be disoriented. I mean, but yeah, that's the Bible. And if we don't allow, in fact, Jared and I were just talking about repression and why we need silence and stillness is so critical. We've got to lead leaders into silence and stillness, because early on in their journey with Jesus, because otherwise it gives the spirit time to get into your false self and go into those layers, kind of like an archaeological tell, and dig out the false layers of self. And he leads us into crises, right? And all these pains and things are falling apart. But when things are falling apart, they're actually coming together, But we got to help. That is part of the process, or else they repress it and you stuff it, and then they end up exploding out. And so we're hopefully want to be guiding people through the stages of life and their journey with Jesus, so that they're not stuffing it and being hyperreactive and exploding out.
What is the value of the discipline of silence in a season like this?
Well, I would say the discipline of silence, not just season like we're in now, but
yeah,
I see silence and solitude as they're indispensable.
Yeah.
Dallas Willard said this years ago, that they're the two most radical disciplines in the West is silence and solitude. I think he's correct. And is it possible to really mature in Jesus without a serious practice of silence? I'm talking about not just silence as a method. I'm talking about a spiritual practice before the Lord in his presence, of not getting something from him, not intercession. It's a contemplative prayer. It's being with Jesus. It's no agenda, letting go. I couldn't survive without it. I mean, it saved my life over the decades, but mine's only deepening as I get older, not decreasing.
Yeah. I went on a walk yesterday. My wife was away, and normally I'd put my AirPods in and listen to an audiobook, some music, or a podcast. And I thought, no, I had them with me. I left them in my pocket, and I just went walking in the woods for 45 minutes, looking at nature, reflecting, talking to God. And 20 years ago, that would have killed me. I would have been like, I'm wasting time. I'm not effective. What could I be doing? And now, like, if I don't get an hour of silence a day, I feel like I haven't lived.
Wow.
I know, it's weird.
Yeah, I do at least 20. I set my clock and I do 20 minutes as part of my morning prayer of just being still before him. But I think more importantly, it's become just a part of my life. Like you said, like before I'm going to speak, if I'm in front of a crowd or a group of people, I'll take, 5-10 seconds just to be still and see the people, be present. And like I said, get in the car, not put the radio on, or a podcast on, and just be silent, and let there be that quiet. Again, it's noisy out here. It's noisy inside.
It's noisy inside. Yeah.
It's noisy everywhere.
Uh-huh.
And so this cultivation of an interior and an exterior silence is it's hard in the beginning, but once you taste it, and I feel like I'm trying to lead people to taste it, not just run from it, because it's all the distractions. It's so hard. But we were made for it. Like once you taste it, you realize, oh my gosh, God made me for this as a core dimension of my spirituality. It's not. I don't think it's a supplemental. It's like Bible study and prayer and silence and Sabbath. These are like core formation disciplines. There's certain ones that we're saved by Jesus alone.
Yeah.
But there are certain core practices that are essential if we're going to be maturing and growing. And I would put silence and Sabbath in there. I think the pandemic and the sense of out of controlness going on around us, there's so much we can't control. Those are invitations to let go. And silence is such a surrender to God's presence and his activity, not mine, my will to his will. I mean, that's the work of the Christian life, isn't it? Just your will, Lord, not mine. That's a scary prayer. If a person doesn't think it's a scary prayer, they don't get it.
It's a terrifying prayer. Yeah, it really is. So your new book is about emotionally healthy discipleship. What distinguishes emotionally healthy discipleship from emotionally healthy spirituality?
Yeah, this book was written to pastors and leaders. So, I mean, emotionally spirituality would be kind of our broad book for the, and that's what our course is built around. It's for everybody. Okay. I wrote Emotionally Healthy Discipleship as probably my final, theological biblical book to lay out. These are the biblical foundations of a discipleship in a culture that deeply changes lives. In other words, this is, in my humble opinion, this is like a new operating system of how are we going to do church in the 21st century with all these massive challenges coming upon us. And so I delineated 7 marks, and they're theological marks, but they've got to be in our lives as leaders, and we bring it to the church. Things such as be before you do, receive God's gift of limits, embracing grief and losses, God's treasures in grief and loss, follow the crucified, not the Americanized Jesus. So I've got, make love the measure of spiritual maturity. We lead out of brokenness and weakness. So what I try to do is really expound on them as clearly as possible, and with the goal of saying, this is the vision of a new, I call it like a new operating system of a computer. It's like, but it's got a bandwidth to expand and take in all that's going on around us. But it draws on 2,000 years of church history and church fathers. And we've got to go outside of our kind of a Western, post-Reformation church and be much broader globally and much deeper historically to get the riches of a spirituality that's got some depth to it, that we can actually multiply deeply changed people. I'm not interested at this point, Carey. I'm old enough. I have no interest in building a crowd. I have zero interest in entertaining people. I want to build churches that are missional, that make a difference in the world. And we're actually developing people that are sustainably 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years faithful to Jesus in their marketplace, right? In the politics and arts and all areas of life. But we've got enough depth in our churches because, these crises are going to just keep coming. I mean, I wouldn't expect clear sailing in our increasingly secular world by any means, but that's okay. The early church did just fine. In a very pagan empire, they did fine. They exploded. Yeah. So I'm not worried about the outside. I'm worried about the inside of the quality of our churches.
So you have thousands of leaders listening right now. They're exhausted. A lot of them are exhausted. The demographics or the data says that, but so does our anecdotal experience. And they're looking to find their footing again in an unstable world. What final word would you want to leave them with, Pete?
You can't fix it. And I can't either. And the most important person to lead right now is yourself. And that is no easy task. To be leading people when events are changing almost, weekly, monthly, there's so much we can't control, that to be anchored in Jesus and yourself, peaceful in a storm because he's in the boat, that takes a miracle. But God is good at miracles. And I would just say, you want to be open to listen to his voice of how he wants to uniquely lead you to slow it down, get anchored so you can listen to him and offer a peaceful word of leadership to lead your people forward and free them from all the anxieties. But you've got to get free yourself. And I would just say that's your number one goal. And if you can do that, you can pull everyone with you. In fact, you can't help but bring everybody with you.
That is a great word, Pete. Always great to talk to you. People, tell us about your podcast, where people can find all the things you're producing online these days.
So I do a podcast. It's called the Emotionally Healthy Leader Podcast, and you can check that out wherever podcasts are found. And I would encourage you to pick up the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship book. It's a great introduction, not an introduction, it's just a great primer. It's my best thinking of what is this paradigm. But it's a great start to get you thinking, okay, this is like, wow. And I would check it out. There's some free discussion guides at emotionallyhealthy.org/discipleship. And I just kind of I wouldn't worry about your church. I wouldn't worry about bringing it to anybody. I would just worry about bringing it to you, and let God come to you for your own life first. And remember, God is not in a rush.
Wow.
It's going to be okay.
It's a good word. Pete, once again, thank you so much. And leaders, thanks so much for joining us this week on Church Pulse Weekly. Hey, we all are navigating a lot. A couple of things that might make it easier from our partners. If you want to delegate some more, check out what belaysolutions.com/Church Pulse has to offer. They've got a free delegation guide. That's BELAY solutions.com/Church Pulse. And then Subsplash has also helped 14,000 churches really connect with people over the last year, and they'd love to help you too. So check out subsplash.com/Church Pulse. Grateful to our partners who help bring us this show to you week after week after week. And we're really grateful for them, grateful for you. We're with you. And we have more this month on mental health. So make sure you subscribe if you haven't done that, and tune in